The cowboy's hidden past. The dust settled slowly around the boots of the man who called himself Seth Walker as he dismounted his horse at the edge of Copper Valley, a small but prosperous frontier settlement nestled between towering red rock formations in the Arizona Territory. It was the autumn of 1888, 3 years after the last major Apache conflicts had officially ended. Though the deep wounds of war still ran like poisoned rivers through the hearts of both settlers and native peoples throughout the harsh and unforgiving Southwest, Seth appeared to be just another drifting cowboy seeking honest work and a chance to start over in a new place where no one knew his history. He was tall and lean, with weathered hands that spoke eloquently of years spent handling cattle and horses under the burning desert sun. His brown hair showed premature streaks of gray that seemed inconsistent with his relatively young age, and his blue eyes carried a haunted quality that suggested he had seen far more than his share of violence, death, and hardship. Most importantly, he kept strictly to himself and asked no probing questions about other people's business, exactly the kind of man that frontier towns appreciated and welcomed. Within a week of his arrival in Copper Valley, Seth had found steady work at the Morrison Ranch, one of the largest and most successful cattle operations in the entire territory. The ranch owner, Big Jim Morrison, was immediately impressed by Seth's obvious skill with horses and his unwavering willingness to take on any job, no matter how difficult or unpleasant. Without complaint, Seth worked from sunrise to sunset every day, never caused trouble in town, avoided the saloons and gambling halls, and seemed genuinely content to live quietly in a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property. For many months, Seth's new life proceeded peacefully and without incident. He earned the genuine respect of the other ranch hands through his consistent hard work and reliability, proved himself absolutely indispensable during the challenging cattle drives, and gradually began to feel like he might finally be able to leave his traumatic past behind forever. The terrible nightmares that had plagued him relentlessly for years began to fade into distant memories, and for the first time since the end of the war, he could sometimes sleep through the entire night without waking in a cold sweat, screaming from dreams of burning villages and dying children. But the past has a way of catching up with those who try to run from it, no matter how far they travel or how completely they try to reinvent themselves. On a particularly warm spring morning, as Seth was carefully breaking a young Mustang in the ranch's main corral, a small group of Apache traders arrived at the ranch. They came under a white flag of truce, as was customary, seeking to trade horses and finely crafted goods for supplies and tools. Big Jim Morrison had always maintained peaceful and profitable relations with the local Apache communities, finding that honest trading was more profitable and infinitely safer than the hostility and suspicion that characterized many other ranches in the region. Among the Apache visitors was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with intelligent dark eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. She wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and her long black hair was adorned with silver ornaments that caught the sunlight. Her name was Aiyana, which meant eternal blossom in her language, and she was known throughout the territory as a skilled negotiator and peacekeeper. Seth was focused on his work with the Mustang when he heard Aiyana's sharp intake of breath behind him. He turned to see her staring at him with an expression of shock that quickly transformed into barely controlled rage. "You," she said in perfectly clear English, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know that face. I know those hands that held the torch." The other Apache traders and several ranch hands immediately sensed the tension. Big Jim Morrison stepped forward, concerned about the potential for violence. "Is there a problem here, Aiyana?" Morrison asked carefully. Aiyana's eyes never left Seth's face as she spoke, her voice growing stronger and more accusatory with each word. "This man is not Seth Walker. This is Colonel James Morrison, formerly of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. 3 years ago, he led the attack on our village at Whispering Creek. He burned our homes, killed our children, destroyed everything we held sacred." The silence that followed was deafening. Seth felt the blood drain from his face as every eye in the corral turned to stare at him. The carefully constructed life he had built over the past year crumbled in an instant. "That's impossible," Big Jim Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Seth's been working for me for almost a year. He's a good man, a hard worker." "Look at his hands," Aiyana commanded. "Look at the scar on his left thumb, shaped like a crescent moon." I remember that scar because those hands signed the order that murdered my people. Seth instinctively glanced down at his left hand, where indeed a crescent-shaped scar marked his thumb, the result of a childhood accident with a broken bottle. It was such a small detail, but one that proved Aiyana's identification was correct. Colonel Morrison. Aiyana continued, her voice now filled with cold fury. You may have changed your name, grown out your hair, and traded your uniform for cowboy clothes, but I would recognize you anywhere. You destroyed my village. You killed my husband. You orphaned my children. Seth, for that had become his true identity in his own mind, finally found his voice. Ma'am, I understand your anger, and I won't insult you by denying who I was, but I need you to understand something important. The man who gave those orders, Colonel James Morrison, died in that village 3 years ago. I buried him in the ashes of what we destroyed. Pretty words, Aiyana spat. But words don't bring back the dead. No, they don't, Seth agreed quietly. And nothing I can say or do will ever undo the horror of that night. But if you'll listen, I want to tell you something about that night that you don't know. Something that might change how you see what really happened. Big Jim Morrison looked between Seth and Aiyana, clearly struggling to process this revelation about his trusted ranch hand. Seth, or whoever you are, what's she talking about? What happened at Whispering Creek? Seth removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture that had become habitual when he was under stress. 3 years ago, I was ordered to lead a punitive expedition against what the Army classified as a hostile Apache settlement. We had reports of raids on supply wagons and attacks on isolated homesteads. My superior officers told me it was a military target. It was a village of families. Aiyana interrupted bitterly. Old people, women, children. We had nothing to do with any raids. I know that now, Seth said with obvious pain in his voice. When we arrived at Whispering Creek, and I saw what we were really being asked to destroy, I tried to stop the attack. I argued with my second-in-command, Lieutenant Williams. I told him these weren't hostile warriors, they were civilians. But you didn't stop it, Aiyana accused. You let your soldiers burn everything. Williams had orders directly from General Harrison that superseded mine. When I refused to carry out the attack, he relieved me of command and proceeded without me. I was placed under guard while my own men destroyed your village. Aiyana's expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with her anger. You tried to stop it. More than that, Seth continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared a secret he had carried alone for 3 years. While Williams and his men were setting fires and rounding up prisoners, I managed to slip away from my guards. I went to the far side of the village, where families were trying to escape into the desert. Seth paused, looking directly at Aiyana. I helped them. I guided families through paths in the rocks that my men didn't know about. I gave them water and supplies for their escape. I probably helped 30 or 40 people get away that night. Lies, Aiyana whispered, but her voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. Your youngest son has a birthmark shaped like a star on his right shoulder, Seth said gently. Your daughter was carrying a doll made of corn husks that she refused to leave behind. You were holding them both as I led your family through the canyon passage to safety. Aiyana staggered backward as if she had been struck. The specific details that Seth provided could only have come from someone who had been there, someone who had helped them escape. But the implications of what he was saying were almost too overwhelming to process. You saved my children. I saved everyone I could, Seth replied. And when I returned to what was left of the village, I found Lieutenant Williams ready to report my heroic leadership in the successful mission. The Army wanted a victory to report to Washington, and they didn't care about the details. Big Jim Morrison stepped forward, his face grave. Seth, are you telling us you were court-martialed for trying to prevent the attack? No, Seth shook his head. I was decorated for it, promoted to colonel and given a commendation for decisive action against hostile forces. The Army needed heroes, and they weren't interested in hearing about my objections or my attempts to save civilians. So what happened? How did you end up here? Seth looked out toward the distant mountains where he had spent so many sleepless nights remembering the faces of the people he couldn't save. I couldn't live with it. The nightmares, the guilt, the knowledge that people called me a hero for participating in a massacre. I submitted my resignation, but the army refused to accept it. They wanted to use my success to justify more aggressive campaigns against Apache settlements. "So you ran away," Aiyana said, her voice now more puzzled than accusatory. "I deserted," Seth corrected. "I walked away from my command, my rank, my identity. I became a wanted man. For the past 3 years, I've been Seth Walker, a drifting cowboy trying to make amends for crimes committed by a man I used to be." The silence stretched between them as Aiyana processed this revelation. The other Apache traders watched nervously, unsure whether they were witnessing a confrontation or a confession. The ranch hands stood frozen, not knowing whether they should intervene or witness this strange resolution of old grievances. "Aiyana," Seth said softly, "I know that nothing I can say will bring back the people who died that night. I know that my efforts to save some lives don't erase the lives that were lost. But I want you to know that not a day has passed since Whispering Creek that I haven't thought about the families I couldn't reach in time." Aiyana studied Seth's face intently, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine anguish and a burden of guilt that had clearly been eating at him for years. "The man who saved my children," she said slowly. "What happened to him?" "He became Seth Walker," Seth replied. "A man who decided that the only way to honor the dead was to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve the second chance he was given. And Colonel Morrison died at Whispering Creek, along with everyone else who believed that following orders was more important than protecting innocent lives." Aiyana walked closer to Seth, close enough to see the lines of pain around his eyes, the premature gray in his hair that spoke of years of sleepless nights and haunted memories. "My husband was named Running Bear," she said quietly. "He was trying to gather the horses when your Lieutenant William shot him. But before he died, he told me to take our children and run toward the rocks, because a soldier with kind eyes had shown him a hidden path." Seth's breath caught in his throat. "I remember him. He asked me if I could be trusted. I told him I was trying to save lives, not take them. He believed you. Because of that trust, our children lived." The emotional weight of this revelation brought tears to both their eyes. After 3 years of carrying guilt and grief separately, they were finally able to share the burden of that terrible night. Big Jim Morrison cleared his throat. "Seth, Colonel, whoever you are now, I need to know, are you still wanted by the army?" "Probably," Seth admitted. "Desertion is a serious crime, especially for an officer. But I think they've written me off as dead. Easier to have a heroic colonel mysteriously disappear than to explain why he abandoned his post. And if they found you? Court-martial, probably execution. Military justice isn't known for its mercy toward deserters." Aiyana stepped even closer to Seth. "Why did you save us that night? You could have followed your orders, protected your career, avoided all of this trouble." Seth was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because when I looked into the face of your daughter holding that corn-husk doll, I saw my own niece back home in Ohio. And I realized that if someone was attacking her village, I would want a soldier to choose humanity over duty. And now? What do you choose now?" Seth looked around the ranch where he had found a measure of peace, then back at Aiyana. "I choose to keep trying to be worthy of the forgiveness that Running Bear showed me when he trusted a soldier with kind eyes." Aiyana nodded slowly. "My people have a saying, the man who saves one life saves the world. You saved more than 30 lives that night. You saved my world." She turned to address Big Jim Morrison and the assembled crowd. "This man carries the burden of terrible orders he was forced to follow. But he also carries the honor of choosing to save lives when he could have taken them. I name him friend to the Apache people of this valley." Big Jim Morrison stepped forward and extended his hand to Seth. "I don't know what name you want to go by, but you're still welcome on this ranch. A man who'll risk everything to save innocent lives is exactly the kind of man I want working for me." Seth shook Morrison's hand gratefully. "Seth Walker died and was reborn at Whispering Creek. That's the name I want to keep." Over the following months, Seth's true identity became an open secret throughout Copper Valley. Rather than ostracizing him, the community gradually came to respect his honesty about his past and his obvious commitment to redemption. Aiyana visited the ranch regularly, initially to trade but eventually to help Seth work through his lingering guilt and trauma. "You cannot change the past," she told him one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "But you can choose what kind of future you build with the lessons it taught you." "I'm trying," Seth replied. "Every day I try to be a little more like the man who saved your family, and a little less like the one who couldn't save everyone. That is all any of us can do," Aiyana said with a smile. "Try to be better tomorrow than we were today." Years later, Seth Walker became widely known throughout the entire Arizona territory as a skilled and trusted mediator between Apache communities and white settlements. His unique perspective, having experienced firsthand both the worst that violent conflict could produce and the best that human compassion could offer, made him absolutely invaluable in preventing the kinds of senseless tragedies that had defined and scarred his earlier life. The ranch hands who worked alongside him every day never knew Colonel James Morrison and his terrible legacy, but they knew Seth Walker as a fair, hard-working, and deeply principled man who would risk his own life without hesitation to protect others, regardless of their race or background. Children in both Apache villages and settler towns grew up hearing inspiring stories about the mysterious cowboy who chose moral courage over personal comfort and redemption over reputation. Seth never fully forgave himself for the innocent lives lost at Whispering Creek, but he gradually learned to carry that heavy burden as motivation for good rather than crushing guilt that paralyzed him. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind whispered through the canyons like the voices of the dead, he could almost hear Running Bear's voice reminding him that trust, once given freely, creates an obligation that lasts forever. The man who had once been a colonel became a cowboy, and the cowboy became a bridge between worlds that had known too much violence and too little understanding. It wasn't the life James Morrison had planned, but it was the life Seth Walker was proud to live.